There's a little cafe near our home by the lakeside, and it's a nice little cafe, so I decided to take my son there for a Sunday evening walk. When I saw the menu, I noticed that under the non-caffeine section, they had their matcha menus there. Now, matcha is obviously a caffeinated drink, so this could be potentially misleading and even dangerous depending on the customer. I explained that to the staff. As a cafe, it's obviously very important to understand that matcha is a caffeinated drink. And not only that, it's also important to understand how much caffeine might be in a matcha as well. So today, let's talk about that. Hi, I'm Yuki, I'm the founder of Tealife, and here we break down Japanese tea so you can become a Japanese tea expert. Let's start with matcha lattes. How much caffeine is there in a matcha latte? Now, this entirely depends on how much matcha you use in that cup of matcha latte. Unlike a loose leaf tea where you extract the nutrients from the tea, for matcha you directly consume the powder, which means that the more powder you use for the matcha latte, the more caffeine you will get. According to MAFF, which is the Ministry for Agriculture, Fisheries, and Forestries of Japan, every 2 grams of matcha will give you 64 milligrams of caffeine. So if you use 2 grams of matcha in your matcha latte, that's 64 milligrams of caffeine. If you use 4 grams of matcha in your matcha latte, that's 128 milligrams of caffeine, and so on and so forth. Now, 4 grams of matcha in your matcha latte is a typical formula, so that might be the rough range of caffeine you might be looking at. Now, let's look at the US FDA recommendations. Their recommendation is up to 400 milligrams of caffeine per day for a healthy person, which means that you can drink up to 12.5 grams of matcha on a daily basis. So you can say that you can drink a fair amount of matcha to reach that limit. However, at the same time, if you love matcha, you can easily exceed that limit as well. Now, it's easy to tell how much matcha you're drinking if you're making it yourself. However, if you're ordering it at a cafe, it's hard to tell. So here's a little bit of a guideline. If your cafe is serving a matcha forward formula, so the matcha is a little bit more prominent, and you're drinking a matcha latte, iced matcha latte of 12-ounce cup, then in that case, you're probably drinking about 4 to 6 grams of matcha per cup, something like that. So from a caffeine perspective, that would be between 128 milligrams and 192 milligrams of caffeine. Remember, the US FDA recommendation is 400 per day, so in that case, you want to keep it at maybe 2 cups per day, something like that. Now, if the cafe is serving a more milk-forward formula, so the milk is more prominent, that probably means that they're using less matcha. In this case, they're probably using between 2 to 3 grams of matcha per cup. And in that case, the caffeine levels would be significantly lower. It would be 64 milligrams to 96 milligrams per cup. So obviously, you'll be able to drink a lot more caffeine, maybe up to 4 cups of that type of matcha latte per day. How about other forms of matcha? How much caffeine do they have? So let's go one by one. Let's start with usucha. Usucha is a thin tea preparation of matcha. It's a traditional way of making matcha. For this, we would generally use 1.5 grams of matcha to 2 grams of matcha, depending on the thickness, which means that for the amount of caffeine, you'll be taking between 43 milligrams to 64 milligrams of caffeine per cup. So it's actually not too bad. For matcha americano, we actually use a similar amount of matcha per cup as the usucha matcha. So same thing, 1.5 to 2 grams of matcha. Now this really depends on the size of the matcha americano cup as well. So there's a dependency there, obviously. Now if you're drinking a koicha matcha is a little bit tricky because the thickness really depends on how you make it. But let's say that maybe typically for one person, you might have 4 grams worth of koicha matcha. I think that's a little bit on the high side in terms of the amount. But let's say it's 4 grams, then that would be 128 milligrams of caffeine that you'll be taking. So I hope that gives you a rough gauge of how much milligrams of caffeine you'll be taking depending on the type of tea you're drinking. Now, how does matcha compare to coffee in terms of caffeine content? Now for coffee, let's say an 8-ounce cup of coffee, then the range of caffeine would be between 70 milligrams to 140 milligrams. So there's a wide range of caffeine there. But let's say the midpoint is 105 milligrams. And then In that case, I'd say that depending on how you drink the matcha, of course, but generally it's comparable, right? If you're drinking it in more traditional forms like usucha, or maybe like a matcha americano, then the caffeine content would be much less than a coffee. However, there is one key difference in the caffeine between coffee and matcha. And it's not necessarily the caffeine itself, it's the substance that complements it. So in matcha and other types of Japanese green tea, there's this substance called L-theanine. L-theanine is an amino acid, and what it does is it counterbalances with the caffeine. So while the caffeine gives you like this high sense of energy, the L-theanine balances it, and overall, it ends up giving you this calm sense of alertness. It reduces the overall jitteriness that you might get from coffee, and also it reduces the so-called caffeine crash. So this is one of the key reasons that recently people have switched from drinking coffee to matcha. Another thing that I commonly hear in terms of the differences between matcha and coffee is the burden on the stomach. So people say that they switch from coffee to matcha because it has less stress or strain on the stomach. And that's true, but it's not necessarily because of the caffeine. It's more because coffee has a little bit higher acidity compared to matcha. Matcha has lower acidity, so therefore it's softer on the stomach. And that's why it's a little bit easier for people to drink. And that's definitely a valid reason for people switching from coffee to matcha. That's all we have for today. I hope this helps. I hope you like the video. Please do subscribe for more great information regarding Japanese green tea. See you in the next video.